European American attitudes of racial and religious superiority led to the creation of the so-called Indian boarding schools.
Misunderstandings between Native Americans and early European settlers over territory, resources, and culture resulted in centuries of conflicts and compromises. Contact with European settlers had devastating results on Native American culture. European diseases and weaponry weakened the Native Americans' ability to protect their lands and way of life. In an attempt to avoid deadly conflict, Native Americans tried to compromise with the Europeans by signing treaties. Unfortunately, Europeans were not looking for compromise, and these treaties were continuously broken. Mass European immigration brought the American population to 23 million by 1850, creating demand for land and resources. In 1845, John O'Sullivan wrote the Manifest Destiny, stating that it was America's
manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us.
The vast expanses of land in the territories of the West were essential for the furthering free development.
The United States government decided to deal with the so-called Indian problem by passing the Indian Appropriations Act in 1851, which relocated tribes to desolate lands that became known as reservations. Once there, Native Americans faced disease, lack of medical attention, and famine. No longer able to hunt and gather in traditional ways, Native Americans were forced to rely on government subsidies to survive.
Let us not depend on politicians to reform the Indian. We cannot safely depend even on the government school to solve the Indian problem. The longest route of hope for the Indians is to be found in the self-sacrifice of the Christian Church.
Reverend Joseph Cook, 1885. In the mid-1800s, Christian missionaries established schools on reservations to save Indian souls and attempt to end hostilities between the European Americans and Native Americans. These missionary schools were partially funded by portions of tribal annuity payments from treaties entered between 1783 and 1871. The main objective of the missionary schools was to convert Native American children to Christianity. European American leaders began to think that in order to end conflict with Native Americans, assimilating them into mainstream society was imperative. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which subdivided reservations, was the first of many pieces of legislation which would lead to the federal government assuming responsibility and funding for Native American schooling.
Carlisle Industrial School was the first government-funded boarding school, founded in 1879 by Captain Richard Henry Pratt. Pratt's philosophy, kill the Indian, save the man, was an overall goal aimed at civilizing people they considered to be savages.
The reasons boarding schools were created was to supposedly address the Indian problem. All those schools back east were created to educate Indians into the so-called mainstream society.
Pratt convinced tribal leaders to send their young children hundreds of miles from their homes to attend school. Military training tactics were used to strip the children of their identities, resulting in mental and emotional trauma. They physically transformed the children's appearance by cutting their hair and replacing traditional dress with military-style uniforms. Children were forced to compromise their individuality to learn white ways.
I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while, until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck and heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit.
Zitkala-sa, 1900. Institutional rules were strictly enforced, and any students caught breaking them faced severe corporal punishment.
One person got out of line. All the companies lined up, took their belts off, and everybody run through the belt line. So you only had to make a mistake one time.
English replaced their native languages, and their religious beliefs were substituted with Christian doctrine. By 1900, half of all Native American languages had become extinct. The Carlisle School philosophy was commonly accepted as the model for Native American education. Unfortunately, this model was abusive and harsh, and led children to believe that their culture and way of life was wrong. This would lead to further conflict between peoples. Between 1880 and 1900, federal funding was used to build new schools, which replaced the older mission schools. Within 30 years, there were 500 off-reservation boarding schools across the nation. Children were taken out of their nurturing home environments and placed in the hands of strangers. Some families sent their children to the schools, hoping to secure their futures. Poverty and the inability to feed and clothe their children was the deciding factor for others, but most were taken against their will. For all of the children attending the schools, the experience would have a profound and sometimes tragic effect on their lives.
There, I'd never been away from home. I was 12 years old. And they put me in an office, and the superintendent said, you're going to go to school a half a day and you work a half a day learning the trade.
The day was split between academic and vocational training. Boys' training consisted of working on the farm, in metal and wood shops, as tailors, harness makers, and as shoemakers. The girls' training focused on domestic work, consisting of sewing, cooking, housekeeping, nursing, and laundry. The schools separated males and females, but both were subjected to military-style marching and drills. All of the students took academic classes in English language, reading, writing, and arithmetic. The schools were underfunded, children weren't well fed, and they lived in poorly built, overcrowded, and uncomfortable dormitories. Illnesses spread rapidly, there was limited medical care, and school cemeteries filled quickly. Desperately homesick children often ran away, only to be taken back and punished. In 1926, Lewis Merriam headed a privately funded study known as the Merriam Report, which investigated the conditions and policies of Native American boarding schools. The report emphasized the shortcomings and inefficiencies of the schools, publicly revealing the lack of medical care, dangerous overcrowding, and excessive labor. It also talked about the emotional effects on children and families that were separated for extended periods. Unfortunately, the report didn't lead to necessary changes.
In the 1930s, there was social pressure for political and economic change in America. The progressive education movement slowly began to change the structure of Native American education. The movement intended to teach children the values of their culture, as well as those of white civilization, to prepare them for life in mainstream American society. During the Indian New Deal, progressive education provided the guidelines for Native American educational policies. As a result, many community day schools were opened, causing the closure of many boarding schools. In 1941, children attending day schools outnumbered those attending boarding schools. Indian service teachers were trained to teach new curriculum in the boarding schools that remained. Albuquerque Indian Schoolboys Advisor observed on 1935 that with the military tactics abolished,
we find a different atmosphere throughout the entire plant. There is more home life and student participation as compared with the old military days.
In spite of these attempts toward change, some of the schools continued to utilize practices and policies of the past.
My younger sister, she was still 5, so she didn't know any better. She went off campus with one of the little Anglo kids, and so the nuns were looking all over for her, and nobody could find her, and then she comes traipsing back over to the dorm, a little bitty girl, and she didn't know that she did anything wrong. So then the nuns, they scolded her, and then they took her upstairs to our dorm, or where we slept, and then they whipped her with a rubber hose.
In 1968, Robert Kennedy headed an investigative report that discovered the fraudulent misuse of funding and similar conditions to those reported 50 years before in the Merriam Report. In 1969, the government spent $18 per Native American student on textbooks and supplies, significantly less than the $40 per student national average. Dropout rates for Native Americans were twice as high as the national average. The Kennedy Report suggested that Native American involvement and control of policy and funding was imperative in the educational process. A new era of Native American activism resulted in the Indian Education Act of 1972 and the Self-Determination Act of 1975, which influenced the way current Native American schools are run.
Overall, my experience compared to my mom's experience is opposite ends of the spectrum. I had a really good experience.
The United States government was forced to admit failure and can no longer deny the need for change. Under demanding pressure from Native Americans, government officials had to compromise their former positions of control. The Tribal Aid Controlled Schools Act of 1988 enabled tribal participation and leadership in the schools.
Santa Fe Indian Schools is still a boarding school, but currently we've taken control of the school, and so we're teaching a curriculum that's more conducive to our everyday today's needs.
After 150 years, Native Americans are finally allowed to educate their own.